Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Melbourne Athletic Development Podcast. Today, we're very lucky to be joined by one of our physio team and weightlifter at a national level, Lydia McCloskey. Lydia, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Can you give our listeners a little bit of a background of particularly some of the people will know that obviously you're one of the mad physios here, but a little bit of background on your sporting journey, because we wanted to talk to you today about how we think that colours the way that you approach your practice. You have a very unique ability to treat injuries and rehabilitate them in a way that I think is heavily influenced by your background, your coaching background, your sporting background. So we wanted to share that with people, and maybe you can give us a bit of an understanding of what that background actually is.
Yeah, sure. So I originally started out in doing a lot of distance sports when I was younger.
Training out all those fast twitch fibers.
Basically, yeah. So I obviously did a bit of rowing, and then I got into some long distance running, and then I realized I actually preferred the gym. And so then I sort of, as everyone does with weightlifting via the CrossFit pathway, found a weightlifting gym, and I've been weightlifting for about 8 or 9 years now, I believe. So yeah, it's been a journey, but a good one. And I think I actually found physiotherapy through weightlifting because of a number of injuries that I sustained through weightlifting, being quite underprepared, coming from like a running background, going into sort of a higher intensity sport. So so I train weightlifting, and obviously I've been in physiotherapy with you guys now for quite a while.
Was it this is
I think it's
4
4 years.
Fourth year,
isn't it?
yeah.
Nice.
So yeah, I guess in terms of how it informs my practice, I think it gives me a really good understanding of anatomy and biomechanics because of the movements that weightlifting involves. And I guess I think I have a pretty good eye for technique, which is actually something I think rowing has instilled in me.
Let's dive into that, because you also did some coaching. We'll go back to your rowing. You actually also did not only rowing but rowing coaching, and you just mentioned there the technical aspect of it. How do you see that influences the way in which you actually approach your assessment and analysis for physio?
Yeah, so quite often I think that people tend to fall into in physiotherapy, like, oh, are they strong enough? Or, oh no, we just have to strengthen this muscle, or you have to do this one exercise to improve it. But I actually think quite often it comes down to the biomechanics of how someone moves and potentially repetitive overload in a certain area. And so obviously your strength and conditioning principles come into that a lot. But I actually think in terms of if you watch how someone moves, then you get an idea of, okay, why is this occurring, or why have they adopted that movement pattern, which is then potentially stressing tissue or underloading tissue, or sort of explaining why certain, their presentation is coming about. So I think because rowing is such a technical sport, and so obviously there's a large fitness component to it. It's so aerobic, but you're not going to move the boat fast unless you put that oar in the water properly and move in unison with everyone else. So I think I've developed quite a good eye for actually watching how people move and understanding why they need to move a certain way.
It's interesting you say that, and I'd like your thoughts on this, because one of the things that I think is really nice, both about rowing and even weightlifting, which I don't always see in running, and I have to kind of arbitrarily create this, is because there are immediate, particularly even tactile, or for weightlifting, it's more outcome-based feedback. You straight away work out that trying to force something doesn't necessarily work. And in rowing, I think it's always really funny. I have a funny story from when I think I was in year 8, and they, as part of a PE class, they send you out to see if people were interested in rowing as they try and recruit people. I was never going to do it because the only thing I could have probably been was the Cox. But they get them in the boat, and I just remember, a group of year 8 boys, throwing this oar into the water and then all getting crabbed and, falling out of the boat and just being absolute idiots, right? And the cool thing about that from a technical standpoint is you get the immediate feedback. If you do not actually place the oar in the water correctly, if you're not in sync, the boat starts to tip, you start to crab, you end up in really bad positions, you're not going anywhere. It actually is hard to do. Whereas when you're doing it properly, it actually feels quite smooth and even, and
Absolutely.
It's not that difficult. And I think that those, if we go to our motor learning thinking, it's one of those, it's a constraints-based model. And with weightlifting, it has that, but also has, we'll talk about it more, but it has that outcome. Like you straight away, I can lift it or I can't. And it's not really, often it can be not a strength factor. But I think that that's one of the nice things that straight away instills in you that technique is really important.
Mm-hmm.
As opposed to, say, running where you might not necessarily get that direct feedback because you're still moving.
Yeah, and even the feedback you might get is someone's beating you, a training partner or a race, but it doesn't really make you feel why you're getting beaten.
Yeah.
And that's something that, like I can talk to it later, but, I spend a lot of time trying to think of how do I get them to actually get that feedback from that tactile sensation. Is that something that, you were immediately aware of when you were coaching rowing or you were even participating in rowing?
Yes and no. I'd say almost sometimes it's 50-50. And it's actually something that, going back to weightlifting has taught me a lot. And something that my coach often says to me is, I don't really care how you feel, because I think as a coach or as an observer, it can be really, really obvious. But as a natural athlete doing it, sometimes you think you're doing one thing, but then you're actually doing something completely different. So as a coach, definitely, or at least what I was trying to instill is like, when an athlete or when the athlete's got their oars in the water at the same time, and then you can sort of almost hear the boat running higher in the water and coming out of the water and floating along. You sort of almost try and teach them to respond to that as opposed to sort of how they feel when they're moving, because quite often even small changes can feel like really big changes or feel wrong or weird.
It's interesting you say that, because I always, from a coaching perspective, I would suggest I emphasize over cueing things from a technical standpoint, because people's perception of change seems very warped. So they'll think, oh yeah, I'm really exaggerating this, and you show them the video and they're like, oh, I wasn't exaggerating that at all.
Yeah.
So for them to actually exaggerate it, you need to over cue the hell out of it, like throw this arm right into the air or whatever it is, so that they actually do start to create change that for them it feels so dramatic, but then they look at, say, their feedback via the video and they're like, oh, okay, that looks pretty normal. Or that was what we were hoping for. And I think that that's something that you, as you mentioned, you only get through the exposure to being in something that is more technical in focus. How did you notice while you were even studying that you were looking at things slightly differently to the people that you were studying with?
I think so. I think it sort of came a lot more naturally to me than others, in terms of like you go to uni and they teach you, people come in with a hip problem, always look at the joint above and below. But I think I've never necessarily looked at anything in isolation. Like if anything, I've found it quite natural to sort of look at how the system moves as a whole, and then work your way back towards, okay, what's happening at this joint or in this area of the body.
What do you think that is? Do you think that's more from the sport and coaching side, or do you think that that's just a personal preference? Because I agree with you. Like I never tend, people will talk about whether it's foot up or, head down, but I tend to see, as you said, more holistically and more whole shapes, even with the way I coach, say weightlifting. We'll talk about that later, but I don't like the idea of part practice.
Yeah.
Right. And I think it's just a personal preference that whenever I try to learn something, I'd like to do the whole thing and allow myself to mold that movement slowly, rather than thinking about like, I'm going to do this part and this part. And Jack can probably talk to this as well. But, obviously with some of our education in that we got very heavily taught through our master's programs, like
step 1, step 2, and it's all part practice for sure.
And it can be very effective for certain people. But I personally, when I'm playing with these things, I don't necessarily like doing that. So I don't tend to coach that way either.
Well, it actually makes me think, and it's probably this point of discussion we've talked a lot about before, about building tissue capacity versus changing biomechanics. And I actually wonder, with the step-by-step process, is it more about building tissue capacity in that particular movement element that then feeds into the improvement of the overall whole movement from a biomechanical standpoint?
Well, I was just going to go touching on your point before, is that I actually think it's just a personality trait in part of it. Because I know that as I'm someone who's generally quite observant of things, and I actually just think it's a personality trait that is then fed into practice. generally, and then all of that sort of part practice that essentially we learn of, like, okay, this is what this is, and this is what's meant to happen at this joint. It sort of then feeds into, okay, this is how I think I've naturally looked at things, and then you just refine it.
That's a really good observation, actually, because
I'm observant, so
it's a very good observation, because I think you're right. I think the people who like part practice are the people who like the weeds. They like the minutiae, and they like playing with small aspects of things. If I just think off the top of my head, the people who like that kind of thing, and I know I'm not like that. I'm broad strokes. I'm big concepts. I like higher level thinking. I can do it, but I don't like it. I find it really annoying.
I find that, I'm like that too, and then that's where I get caught out sometimes. I'm like, okay, I've missed this detail here, which actually has been really important.
I was going to say, did you find that difficult then when studying? Because I feel like there often can be an overemphasis on focusing on a particular region or segment.
Yes and no. Yes, because I felt like I was just missing detail, and it sort of just felt like there were black spots in my knowledge, because the university is very good at teaching you sort of discrete bits of information, but it took me a while to actually then be able to put them all together and sort of look at it as a whole. But then also no, because I was really good at rote learning. So I was just able to basically write verbatim what they wanted you to write.
It's also a good skill to have.
Yeah.
We might actually go through your process with that. So I think it's important to kind of do this both from the injury standpoint, but also, maybe a coaching standpoint. So we've had discussions before about biomechanics, but I would love to get your idea on how you do this from an assessment point of view. And we might use something that's in your wheelhouse of weightlifting, say like a squatting motion.
Mm-hmm.
Can you run us through, if you're assessing someone's squat because they've got, lower back pain, or they're getting some hip pain or something, or knee discomfort, what are the kind of movements, what are the segments, what are the holistic things that you're looking for?
Mm-hmm. So obviously it will sort of depend on what area of the body they're coming in for in terms of maybe what I'll look for first. But a really big one is also just looking at their anthropomorphics. So actually looking at, okay, do they have a long...
That's really cool you say that. Okay, go, explain.
Yeah. So that if they have a long torso, if they have long femurs, if they have... so basically just looking at how their body's actually composed. And I also will look at...
Before you keep going, what do you think that does? And what... I know that you're probably aware of it because of weightlifting, and it's something I've been talking to people about, thinking about it from a running perspective. What things are you noticing, and what do they seem to correlate with depending upon their anthropometrics?
Well, it sort of changes about like how they're going to create their power, their speed, and their positions, because obviously in all sports there is like an ideal standard, but you're not necessarily trying to mold everyone towards that, but you're trying to take the elements that they can use. So you're trying to, make the most of what they have. So for example, someone who's got really long femurs is going to have to be in more of a hip dominant squat. They're not going to be able to sit as upright. If they do, then they're going to create a lot more loading through their back. But then what you have is a greater lever that they can then use to either pull from the floor or stand up. So it's important to sort of understand, okay, how is this person going to be best be able to move or make advantage of what they got, instead of necessarily...
You mentioned the back thing. So do you see that as part of why certain people develop certain injury patterns?
Yes and yes. Yeah. So sometimes I think people, especially people who don't necessarily have a good understanding of things like compound movements and everything, they'll try and force people into certain positions. So example, like your general PT's got the, they're trying their best, but they might be like, you have to be really upright through your chest, but you have this person who's just super, super tall. And so where they're trying to stay really upright through the chest, where they should be folding more through the hip, is going to be creating, load and tension through areas which are going to be much higher on, say, someone who's got a, shorter legs or something like that, purely because of the way gravity and everything works. So,
I think those are those general like principles of, physics and basic, understanding of biomechanics and levers, and thinking, okay, like if they're structured like this, how do you think this thing's going to fold under the force of gravity and obviously external load? And the saying that I always love that comes from a track and field coach is, Sir Isaac Newton is undefeated when it comes to sport. And it's just true, because at the end of the day, the, laws of physics actually hold true in our movements as well.
When extending from that too, do you think then, Lydia, that the movement patterns we create, do you think that that's really our way of trying to optimize movements based on anthropometrics? Or do you think that a lot of the time you actually need to train people to use their particular morphology to their advantage? Or do you see probably a combination of the two?
A combination. And I actually think of something that I remember I heard you telling a patient a couple of years ago of like movement will always choose the path of least resistance. So I think people naturally, when they start moving, will move in a way that suits their body the best. But then over time, depending on where they have maybe like restrictions in their mobility or where they're stronger, they'll start using those elements more. And so my preference in terms of coaching is to just get people to do a movement and see how they move and see how naturally their body wants to do it. And then you start to sort of tweak things. So there's a few things in terms of like, say, if we take the squat which have to happen is that you don't really want much variance sort of in the bar path, because if you're sort of having these huge sort of movements back and forward, then you're going to disrupt the tension you're creating through your core. You're going to unlock, you're not going to be able to produce as much force. You're going to want to stack nicely through your ribs over your hips so that you can take a big breath in and create that sort of intra-abdominal pressure. And you're obviously going to be wanting to use either your hips or your knees, depending on if you're doing a high bar or low bar back squat, to create that extension on the way up. But then in terms of how people do it, okay, well, how do they naturally set up? Do they have a wider stance, a narrower stance? And I sort of would get people to move within their own constraints, but try and get them to move how they naturally feel comfortable, and then we sort of chip away at that or sort of make modifications to that, because I think whatever feels most comfortable to the athlete is the best starting point, especially if they've been doing it for a while, as opposed to someone who's like fresh in and you can sort of mold them a little bit more. But if they have sort of been doing the movement a bit and potentially adopted some bad habits, you see, okay, where are they starting from, and then chip away from there.
When you say chip away, so what are the things you're starting? So, like, and let's maybe use an example, because I think people like the case study, and you can pick one of them, and you maybe give us say if it's someone's doing a squat, and pick a certain area of, say, discomfort that they're getting, as well as maybe their anthropometric structure, and you might have off the top of your head an example of a patient you've seen recently, and then explain to us like maybe how you did chip away at that technical focus to start shifting the discomfort that they're getting when they do that task.
Well, I think the sort of the first one that comes to mind is sort of people who are getting a lot of back pain, and quite often like people actually are squatting quite well, but it can be almost like an over-cueing type thing. So the most recent example that comes to mind is someone who's sort of getting the thoracolumbar junction, sort of that lower to mid back pain with squatting. And the main thing really is that they haven't been able to create a stiff trunk with breathing. So they've been overarching and overextending through their back when they go down into that squat. So quite often even just like teaching people how to brace properly. And then almost you go the other way of like, okay, we'll just relax in the bottom of a squat and see how that feels, versus then if you create that over tension, and then sort of just get them to feel both ends of the extreme. And then you can sort of help cue them into that middle ground where they need to be.
Speaking of which, you said issues with overcueing. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because I feel like nowadays there is an emphasis to use lots of cues and sort of fit into a very kind of refined way of creating a movement. Do you see issues or limitations to that approach?
Yes. Like sometimes like you do have to be specific. Sometimes you sort of have to be a bit more general. And I think there's a few different types of overcueing. The one that comes to mind when you sort of just said there is that sometimes at competitions, weightlifting competitions, you have sort of more novice coaches. The athlete goes out and they literally are yelling at the athlete to do every single thing. It's like, all right, set up, take a big breath. That's it. Okay. And pull. Yep. Stand it up. Wait. All right. And jerk and drive. Hold. All right. Put it down. And you're sort of like, okay, you literally gave them no information, but you sort of overcued every step. And then I think sometimes it's just sort of what John says. Sometimes you have to overcue, but I
don't think in a competition environment you have to overcue.
You're not yelling out to the track, John.
Yeah. All right, take your marks.
Take the next step.
Yep. And the next one. Keep
do
breathing.
it really quickly.
Yeah.
No, because the other thing I think about too when it comes to cueing and learning a movement is, I guess, timeline for change and how much autonomy and flexibility you give someone to explore changing movement. I feel like sometimes there may be an expectation that, okay, like you look at someone's squat, you could use the example you gave before where, say, overarching through the thoracolumbar region of do you from that point on expect to see every subsequent squat with certain cueing to be perfect, or do you think there is a bit of a period where you have to allow someone to explore feeling that change and being able to essentially reorganize their movement pattern?
Definitely people need a period, I think, of time to change. And then this is sort of where I think feedback becomes really important with coaching, because as we were saying before, often you'll tell someone to do something and that it just feels like so warped in terms of like you'll tell them to sort of stack a little bit more, so flex almost slightly more through their back, and they'll be like, oh, I feel like a turtle or something like that, when really they're sort of straight. So you show them video footage and like, oh, actually no, I see what you mean there. It also depends on athlete to athlete. So some athletes, and I'm sure you'll get this, John, as well, and even like with patients, it's sort of some adapt to things really, really quickly, and they have really good awareness of what's happening in their body, or at least they have sort of the skills to know how to change their body. And then there are those athletes where you sort of banging your head against the wall. Yeah, you're literally sort of just banging your head against the wall because you're like, how do I explain this in any more simple terms? And how do I, like, unless I'm literally forcing you into position every single time you go up to the bar, like, I don't know how else to convey this. And sometimes...
Well, actually, talk about that, because I think that that's the nice interaction between coaching and retraining movements that does really help as a healthcare practitioner. What are some of the ideas and tips that you have for people who they can clearly see someone's not running well, they can see they're not moving well with a squat, they're not positioning well? What do you actually do when you've tried lots of different simple cues and it's just not working? What are the things that you try and do with them?
I try and get them to critique their own, say, video or performance. So I say, okay, well, what do you see happening here? And then they sort of might be able to pick up on, oh, yeah, that's right. Or, oh, yeah, no, it does look like, like overstriding, or like, for example, of running, or like, oh, yeah, I am shifting. I can see my weight shift back. Quite often I'll ask them to explain it back to me, or sort of like be sort of quite specific and like, okay, what don't you understand? Or can you sort of explain to me what you think I'm trying to say or trying to convey? And then quite often I'll ask them, okay, well, how would you describe this movement? And then using their language, I'll try and explain it back to them, because yeah, sometimes in my head I'm like, it's so clear, why don't you get it? And then it's because they have a different affiliation or association with certain terms or phrases that haven't necessarily clicked. And then other times it literally is just time. Like, I remember back coaching rowing, the number of times I was just trying to get this one athlete just to be faster dropping their oar in at the catch, or sort of, when you get to the top of the stroke, putting the oar in quickly so they don't have to get there faster, but they just have to, when they're there, put the blade in faster. And I tried so many different ways. And then another coach came along for the session. Word for word, they said exactly what I said. And then the athlete's just like, oh, I get it. And the coach was much more experienced than me. And they just turn around, like, sometimes it just takes another voice to say it.
It's interesting you say that, because I think as a weightlifter, I'm sure you can admit, and it's the same when I'm working with the track athletes, it's like the technical focus is there no matter if you're going, you guys, light or heavy or in between or in competition or in training. And it doesn't matter how much you practice it, you're always striving for improvements in that technical focus. So I just find it really funny when you're working with someone that they have sometimes an expectation that that's going to change in a really short period of time, whether it's, for me with running or for you with a lifting movement. And I find that interesting that people don't see that it's a constant evolution of their movement pattern. And the big thing that I always think that confuses people, and I had an athlete that I used to coach that I think this used to confuse him so much, because whereas people's capabilities improve, whether that be range of motion, whether that be their strength or power profile, you actually need to keep adapting cues and the tasks and the exercises and the technical information that they get, because that changes with those features changing. And I remember him getting really confused with me when I would say like one thing and then I'd say almost the complete opposite maybe 3 or 4 months later. It's like, you said this. It's like, yeah, because you've actually been able to achieve that. So we now need to maybe swing back to the middle a little bit more, or we need to keep evolving what we're doing because you actually have more capability in that area. And I mentioned the idea of overcueing. Sometimes you might overcue so much and you've now got the outcome. So you need to, as I said, bring it back to the middle a little bit.
Yeah, that's definitely something that I know that my coach has done, because, we'll be working on one part of the pull for a really, really long time. And then suddenly, finally, okay, we've gotten that. And then it's something, all right, well, cool. Now we've got to start your finish or change your start position.
Yeah. And
Because
you're like, why are you changing this? And it's
yeah.
like, because you can now do that.
And that's something that I think has evolved over time, is that when I was even just like going back like 3 years ago, like my coach would be starting to make these technical changes that to me just felt so foreign that I would almost get angry and grumpy and be like, this is so annoying, like it's so frustrating. But as I've matured both as like a practitioner and athlete, it's like, okay, I know that this will end up being better, and I know that I sort of has to feel uncomfortable, and that we do have to continue to make these changes in order to then, progress, continue to evolve. And I think it becomes sometimes harder the more elite you get, because the room for error sort of changes, and the degree to which you change becomes sort of smaller, because you're slowly becoming closer and closer to what the ideal is, or perfect, that sometimes those changes can be so small, but they can make a massive difference in the outcome.
A topic of conversation that John and I have spoken about a few times with different guests is a relationship between tissue capacity and biomechanics. I'm interested to hear your thoughts with your experience working with weightlifters or people with resistance training movements, of when you see a biomechanical error, how much that is a reflection of tissue capacity deficits, whether it be related to flexibility, asymmetries in strength, power. What are your experiences with observing an individual doing a resistance training or weightlifting movement and thinking, I need to retrain this movement, versus I need to address the tissue capacity deficits and then see how their system responds to improvements in the tissue capacity deficits you identify?
I think quite often it depends on the body part. So quite often shoulder pain in weightlifters, I find, tends to be a little bit more biomechanical, or especially sort of, I should probably say more CrossFitters, because quite often what coaches, and especially sort of like less experienced CrossFit coaches, will cue is, head forward, arms back in a snatch position,
Yes.
because they're trying to achieve that upright position of the bar being stable overhead, where really, you want your hands sort of over your shoulders. Whereas if you go into this position, you're just going to be creating
Much more vulnerable.
and a lot more force through the front part of the shoulder, the anterior shoulder. So I find quite often when I get people coming in who are getting pain in snatches and everything, but the other movements like pull-ups and dumbbell work, they don't really get much pain. I'm like, okay, that's most likely a biomechanical thing. And I've had people come in for sort of 2-3 sessions. I've literally just been getting them to overhead squat and being like, okay, change your bar position, to like relax your neck, just eyes forward. And then after they've sort of been cueing that, they're like, oh yeah, like I don't have any shoulder pain. As opposed to, again, sort of a weightlifting example is that we are very, very quad dominant in a lot of the movements we do. So quite often weightlifters, CrossFitters, they come in with back pain, and you're like, you have zero like hamstring strength, or you have such poor capacity, even though your back is quite strong. They come in for back pain, but it's mostly because their back is so strong, it's completing most of the movement, and they don't necessarily have that hamstring glute strength and power to actually support those movements. So quite often that's where I actually find it's more of a tissue capacity deficit.
Well, and I was going to say, John, do you also see that sometimes there's a limitation with programming as well, where there's too much emphasis on doing the big compound movements, but actually not doing enough of the accessory development stuff too?
Yeah, definitely. And like, again, I'm pretty lucky in that, because I've been working with my coach for so long. I think we have a pretty good relationship in that I've learned a lot of coaching elements from him. But then I think he's also learned a lot in terms of some of that accessory, and he's always been pretty good with it. But in terms of, okay, we do actually have to treat a little bit more of these like isolated muscle groups for just the general global health.
Well, and I think also that fits in with the comment you made before about John, that statement of the body always follows the pathway of least resistance, where when you do compound movements or complex movements, we are trying to create efficiency.
Yeah.
But that obviously means that we then overutilize certain parts of our body that we have a mechanical advantage to do so. And as a result, then start to develop deficiencies in other areas that we're probably predisposed to doing. I think that's where that relationship between the compound versus the more accessory isolated movements is really important.
Yeah, absolutely.
I wanted to ask you to describe maybe some of the common injuries that we see. You've already mentioned a couple of them, and the process that you go by, as Jack, asked you in relation to, working out whether it's one or the other, or a combination of both. What are some of the most common? You've already mentioned shoulder, back. What are some of the other common things that you see in these sort of lifting populations?
I tend to see a fair bit of hip pain
Okay.
as well. And I actually think a lot of it is generally from sort of like a younger age, potentially. So quite often people who've played like change of direction sports, field sports, and that sort of stuff. And I find weightlifting will really bring that out because it requires so much strength and power from end range
Here's
positions.
a question for you, because I know we've spoken about this. What do you think is the influence of people who probably aren't anthropometrically designed to do those sports still wanting to do them?
I think it's just expectation.
Yeah.
I think they just potentially have to change their expectation for either time frame, how good they're going to get, or how good their body's going to feel. I think weightlifting is also one of those sports where you're probably not going to feel great. Like if you're doing it to a high level.
Well, the reason I say that is because obviously I know that
I think of the transfer of gymnasts to weightlifters as a good example of thinking about limitations of certain individuals and their background.
It seems like, like there's the people who do well, either they're from a gymnastics type movement background, or they typically will be from a specific sort of geo kind of ethnic group. So you see a lot of
predisposed to hypermobility.
Yes, you see Asian populations do very well in weightlifting across pretty much the whole spectrum of the weight classes.
Yeah.
You see the same thing even with like the Eastern Europeans. Now, obviously, they have a propensity to do it because they respect strength sports, and so they're probably going to drive. Culturally, they want to do those sports, but you don't tend to see, say, as many of the Western European states doing well. And I often think, like, we've spoken about, for instance, like Anglo-Celtic kind of stuff.
They don't those deep hip sockets.
Yeah. They don't really have the ability to get in those deep positions, so they're probably not well suited to going into weightlifting, where you, as you said, you have to get into such deep position.
Yeah.
I also think about that too, because I feel like there's often a lot of misinformation around the relationship between flexibility and strength or power.
Yeah.
Yet I feel like weightlifting is the perfect example of epitomizing you need both, and the ability to be able to produce power through a large range requires a great range of movement.
I've had a lot of discussions with people coming in being like, oh, I was told stretching would make my hips unstable, or I thought stretching was going to like make me less strong. And it's like, well, actually probably the more you do weightlifting, the more you need to do mobility, because as a result of trying to create stiffness and strength, you are going to become stiffer and less mobile. And so both from a performance perspective of still being able to achieve those positions, but also like a joint health perspective, mobility is just so important. And it's probably one of the big things like when people come in with hip pain, back pain, first thing I'm like, well, okay, you can't even kneel. So, of course, you're going to be getting some knee pain because you don't actually have the normal
you can't get into a deep knee position, and then you're trying to put lots of load on that. Are you surprised that your structures are screaming?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, with that in mind then too, do you think actually there are times where you have to adapt their lifting techniques because there are simply limitations to what certain joints can achieve from a range of movement perspective?
Definitely. That's an area where it depends on who the athlete is and who their coach is, because I don't necessarily want to step on people's toes. And also it's one of those ones where they might actually be working on it. And if their coach potentially has got like a certain like pathway in their mind of like, I want to do this before doing this. So it's something that I'll often suggest. But if they're not being coached by someone who I know quite well, then I sort of would say, okay, well, these are my suggestions. I actually think that because of X, Y, Z, potentially in some of your movements, like maybe we need to like widen or narrow your snatch grip. Maybe we need to actually think about these technical cues. I'd like you to discuss this with your coach, and whether or not they think that this is feasible. Whereas other times, if I know the coach quite well, I'll just be like, oh, this person's hips are shocking. Like we actually have to probably address this a little bit or change the way they're doing this for a while before we actually can.
Well, I think also too in the presence of pain or pathology where there may be limitations to that person's inability to stop irritating their hip because they're getting impingement repeatedly because their actual bony morphology at the hip or, even at the ankle, for instance, limits their ability to reach certain deep positions that may be beneficial to their performance, but not to their musculoskeletal health.
It's one of the things that I notice the most, I think, and I'm not going to say a particular activity. But for people who especially undertake, say, strength training in more of a group type environment, and there's lots of different ones of varying different levels of difficulty, but certain people are obviously, they find it enjoyable, but they're not that well suited from the anthropometric standpoint. And so it can be really interesting because you say, like, you're actually just not that well suited to this task. It's why you can't lift as heavy, or it's why you're slower when you do this. You know, we see that obviously in sports where the outcome, and it's different when you're doing these activities that are, you know, say fitness-based activities. They're doing it not for the outcome. They're, in terms of, like, you know, they're not really doing it competitively for that.
The performance outcome,
And you've got a group of non-homogeneous individuals of very different, a lot of differences in training history, anthropometrics, and so on.
In competitive environments, say weightlifting or running or whatever, you kind of self-select. Like, if you're slow, you keep going out in distance because you're like, I'm not fast enough to. So, and that might be driven by your anthropometric structure and your, you know, your your muscle physiology,
muscle phenotype, and so on.
Exactly. Yep. Same thing happens in weightlifting. You know, like, if you really just can't do it and you can't be in the positions, and you're
go to powerlifting.
Well, well, if the phenotype is correct.
Yeah.
But typically, like, you find people self-select out of it because they're just not actually that good at it. I think I always find the challenge when I'm dealing with someone who, you know, they do, you know, the circuit-based sessions, and like, oh, we always do all of this task. It's like, well, based on your history, as you said, you played hockey and you've got really poor hip mobility because of the change direction, or rowing, or whatever it is, or they're really tall, and you're like, you getting into really deep squats all the time and you're 6'6", like, it's probably not your activity.
It's funny you say that. When I was doing a lot of weightlifting and I was getting lessons from Simplice, he obviously had enough intelligence to look at me and go,
nah.
Yeah, Ben's short. He goes, you're 6'4", you know, you weigh 85 kilos and you're trying to do clean and jerk and snatches. And he actually got me doing a lot of bodybuilding type stuff. He's like, mate, the first thing you need to do is get some muscle mass on you, because, you know, you're just tall and relatively lean. And it's interesting, that standpoint of, like, you know, in comparison to someone like him who was an elite weightlifter of relatively short stature and large amounts of muscle mass.
Well, that's what they typically are, aren't they? You know, if
Of
you look at
course.
weightlifters, generally they're small. Even the super heavyweights, they're not tall people.
Well, I mean, the taller you are, the further you got to lift that bar off the ground.
And that's that leverage that we spoke
When I
about.
left rowing and joined weightlifting, I just thought I found my people. I was always the shortest at rowing.
I still haven't found my people, man. Should have stuck with rowing.
One of the things that I wanted to talk to you about, and it might be brief, but is how you approach, as I said, creating constraints for people in a teaching perspective, say as a physio, because, as I mentioned, in terms of sport, say like a lifting task, you often get that feedback. You can't move the weight or you can't get into the position. And so the constraint is actually that the outcome pulls you back and you're like, okay, I have to improve this technical focus. But if someone's, and pain can be that constraint, but do you go through a process of trying to work out, okay, what activity can I give them that drives that movement or drives that task? You know, like, I know that I do a lot of modification for people, say with squatting. One of the first things you often do for someone who's not as aware is, if you think their ankle range is poor, like, you'll chop them up on something like, I need you to do this until we get the ankle range. And I'm creating, it's not so much a constraint, it's more of an attractor, but you're creating an opportunity for them to be able to do that. And then you're like, okay, you can get into a better hip and knee position.
Well, yeah, weightlifting or sort of like gym-based activities are great for that reason, is that they already are in such a, you talk about like your kind and your wicked environments. It is such a controlled environment. In some ways, I almost feel like I'm cheating sometimes, because it's like, yeah, it's so easy. Okay, cool. So you're getting pain, this range of motion. We're going to take you out of that range of motion, but then you're going to be working on, you know, how you sort of moving from that top of the squat and everything. And then in the meantime, we're going to work on, okay, your start position from the floor. We're not necessarily going to move you into end range positions, but we can sort of work on these other things which are feeding into that sort of end result, or sort of work on, you know, say like, okay, so you're slow getting under, and because you're slow, you're rocketing to the bottom, just getting like absolutely like slammed by the bar, which is, you know, hurting your hips. So what we're going to work on in the meantime is, okay, try and get you faster. So maybe some like Biometrics or some more sort of non-barbell based activities. But yeah, I find actually weightlifting or sort of anything sort of strength resistance based exercise is actually probably one of the easiest ones, I think, to modify, because although it's really hard to replicate the forces and the velocities required at heavy weights, unless you're doing a heavy weight, it is still very easy to reduce the movement to, say, like a certain part of the pull, or, you know, that strength in the part of the squat, or even just working on sort of that bottom up position. So
Well, I also think too, when you add resistance, it adds extra feedback.
definitely, yeah.
You know, because I think the simple thing is, because when you add resistance, there's more tension. And as there's more tension, you get more proprioceptive feedback. So it's actually to your advantage in many ways.
Absolutely.
I don't actually know. I'm interested to actually maybe talk to a swimming coach whether actually it's harder, you know, say the water, because there's less feedback.
Well, that's why I think they often will use, you know, like the paddles and stuff like that to create resistance. And I know they're doing a lot of resistance swimming now. Which I don't know that they're necessarily doing for feedback. I think they're just doing it to improve the power and stroke and things
Progressive
like that.
overload, sure.
Yeah. Lydia, something we always ask our guests is if there's anything that at the moment they're exploring that's taking their interest that may not be in their professional practice, but it's piquing their curiosity. Is there anything that doing that to you at the moment?
Early on a Friday morning. I guess nothing.
Plastering,
renovating a house. Yeah.
No, my partner's doing all the work there. Punching nails is the task that I'm trying to learn how to do. I'm shocking with a hammer. It's just like a normal nail, but otherwise, no, not really. No, more, I think sort of just more like little bits of sort of self-exploration and everything. So nothing really sort of like major, but I think I think this last sort of few weeks I've had a few patients who've been like, oh, okay, I've missed a couple of things, or sort of just taking a step back and sort of just reflecting on, I guess, again, the bigger picture, and sort of saying, okay, where can I improve? What
Are you going through any formal process with that? Like, are you looking into, you know, what's out there in terms of, you know, clinical review processes, or, you know, research that looks at how you can actually evaluate that clinical performance?
Not so much. I've sort of I've started actually recommendation from my partner, listening to just a little bit more about, I guess, like a podcast based on like why we are the way we are now, and sort of like a lot of the it's called sort of the meaningful, or the meaning crisis. Sort of, you know, why do people sort of have these issues of like lack of meaning in their life and everything at the moment?
Getting to very philosophical, psychological.
Yeah, but it's sort of interesting, because it's sort of taking you on a journey in terms of like, you know, well, why, like one of the episodes was talking about like the flow state and everything, and what's necessary to get into the flow state, and why we sort of like why it is useful, and you know, like why it has sort of come about, and more recent research and everything. So like not really necessarily looking into anything major.
What was the name of that podcast?
I think it's called the like Awakening from the Meaningful Crisis, or I can't remember the exact name. It's by John Vivank, I think his name is.
Yeah. He's done some podcasts with Jordan Peterson, actually.
Yeah,
I know.
it's a long series. It's something like 42 episodes or something like that. So I'm on the beginning of my journey.
But just something light then, really.
Yeah,
just focusing on your personal life.
Lydia, thank you so much for joining us and sharing some of your knowledge in relation to your physio work, your coaching, and obviously your weightlifting involvement. We do appreciate you taking the time.
It's been a pleasure.
And of course, for all of our listeners, do please like, subscribe on whatever platform, and share. And it really helps to be able to share the message and for us to reach more people.